In the vast, untamed wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains, a silence reigns, deep and profound. It's a silence broken only by the howling wind that sweeps across endless expanses of snow and ice. This is a land of stark beauty and unforgiving nature, where the line between adventure and peril is razor-thin. It was here in the cold, desolate heart of Soviet Russia that a story began in the winter of 1959. It was a story that would end in mystery, a chilling tale whispered across generations. This story is not just about a tragedy, it's about an enigma that has defied explanation for over 60 years, a puzzle with missing pieces that continue to haunt investigators, researchers, and anyone who dares to look into its dark, unsettling depths. The tale belongs to 9 young souls, vibrant and full of life, who ventured into this frozen landscape with spirits high and hearts set on adventure. They were experienced hikers, students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, well versed in the challenges of the wild. Their goal was a formidable one: to conquer Otorten Mountain, a peak whose name, in the local Mansi language, ominously means, "Don't go there." They were prepared for the biting cold, the strenuous climbs and the harsh conditions. What they were not prepared for was the inexplicable terror that awaited them on the slopes of a nameless mountain, a place that would later bear the name of their leader, Dyatlov Pass. What happened to these 9 individuals on a fateful night in early February has become one of the most compelling and baffling unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The official records are sparse, the conclusions unsatisfying, and the evidence left behind is a confounding collection of contradictions. The hikers fled their tent in a state of apparent panic, cutting their way out from the inside into the sub-zero temperatures, inexplicably leaving behind their warm clothing, shoes and supplies. Their bodies were later found scattered across the mountainside, some with traumatic, crushing injuries inconsistent with a simple hiking accident, and others with no visible signs of harm, having simply frozen to death in the unforgiving cold. The questions that arose from the discovery are as chilling as the wind that blows across Kolatsiakul, or Dead Mountain. Why did they abandon the relative safety of their tent in such a hurry? What could have caused such a powerful, overwhelming sense of fear in a group of seasoned mountaineers? Why were some of the bodies found with such violent internal injuries, yet with no external signs of a struggle? And why did some of their clothing show traces of radioactivity? These are the questions that formed the foundation of the Dyatlov Pass incident, a mystery that draws us in with its strange and terrifying details, leaving us to wonder what truly transpired on that dark, frozen night. The group that set out on this ill-fated expedition was the epitome of youthful ambition and camaraderie. They were not reckless amateurs, they were a collective of skilled and knowledgeable ski hikers, each one certified for the challenging trek ahead. The expedition was classified as a Category 3 hike, the most difficult rating at the time, requiring immense physical endurance and survival expertise. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student known for his meticulous planning and quiet confidence. He was the architect of their journey, the one who had charted their course through the northern Urals. He was respected by his peers and trusted to lead them through the wilderness and back to civilization safely. Joining him was a close-knit group of friends and fellow students, each bringing their own unique skills and personality to the team. There was Zinaida Kolmogorova, a spirited and determined young woman who had been on many expeditions before. Lyudmila Dubinina was known for her courage and her beautiful singing voice, which often lifted the spirits of her companions on long journeys. Alexander Kolevatov was a student of nuclear physics, a quiet and serious young man. Rustem Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Yudin were all robust and experienced members, ready for the physical demands of the trip. The oldest member, Semyon Zolotaryov, was a mysterious figure, a 38-year-old instructor who had joined the group at the last minute, bringing with him a veteran's experience from World War II. Their journey began with a sense of excitement and great anticipation. They documented their initial days with cameras and kept detailed diaries, leaving behind a poignant record of their final adventure. The photographs show them smiling, laughing, and working together, full of the optimism that only the young and adventurous possess. Their diary entries speak of the beauty of the winter landscape, the challenges they faced with good humor, and the strong bond of friendship that united them. They were a team, in the truest sense of the word, facing the vast emptiness of the Urals with a shared sense of purpose and a belief in their collective strength to overcome any obstacle that nature could throw their way. On January 27th, one member, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back due to recurring sciatic pain. It was a decision that would ultimately save his life, but it would also burden him with a lifetime of guilt and unanswered questions. As he bid farewell to his 8 friends, he could never have imagined that he would be the last person to see them alive. The remaining 9 pressed on, deeper into the wilderness, toward their destiny on a desolate mountain slope. Their diaries and photographs offer the last glimpses into their world, a world that was about to be shattered by an unknown and terrifying force, leaving behind a legacy of fear and speculation that continues to this day. The plan was simple yet ambitious. After Yuri Yudin's departure, the remaining 9 hikers were to continue their trek, aiming to cross the pass and reach the base of a Torten mountain. From there they would make their ascent. They were scheduled to send a telegram to their sports club from the village of Vijay no later than February 12th, signaling the successful completion of their journey. It was a routine communication, a simple message to let everyone know they were safe. But as the days ticked by, February 12th came and went with no word. At first, there was little concern. Delays were common on such difficult expeditions. Weather could hold up a group for days. Igor Dyatlov himself had said a delay was likely. However, as more days passed in silence, a quiet unease began to creep in among the families and friends waiting back home. The complete lack of communication was uncharacteristic of such a well-organized group. The silence from the mountains grew heavier with each passing day, transforming from a minor concern into a gnawing, dreadful fear. By February 20th, with still no sign of the hikers, the families demanded action. A search and rescue operation was officially launched. Volunteer groups composed of fellow students and teachers from the institute were the first to mobilize, their hearts heavy with worry for their missing friends. Soon the army and police forces joined the effort, deploying planes and helicopters to scan the vast snow-covered terrain. The search was a monumental task. The area was immense, remote, and buried under deep layers of snow. For days, the search parties found nothing but an endless sea of white. The hope of finding the hikers alive began to dwindle with each fruitless day. The weather was brutal, with temperatures plummeting far below freezing and fierce winds making the search conditions treacherous. The rescuers battled the same elements the hikers had faced, gaining a grim appreciation for the unforgiving environment. They scoured the projected route, following the faint traces of ski tracks whenever they could find them, their calls echoing unanswered in the desolate valleys. Then, on February 26th, a breakthrough came. A search pilot spotted something unusual on the eastern slope of a mountain known as Kolatsiakal. A ground team was directed to the location, and what they discovered was the first piece of the chilling puzzle. It was the group's tent, half buried in snow and strangely abandoned. The scene was deeply unsettling. It was clear that the tent had been violently cut open, not from the outside, but from within. Inside, all of the group's belongings, their warm clothes, their boots, their food, and their equipment were left behind, neatly arranged as if they were meant to be used. The hikers were nowhere to be seen. It was as if they had fled in a blind panic into the lethal cold, with nothing to protect them. The discovery of the abandoned tent only deepened the mystery and heightened the sense of dread among the search teams. The scene made no logical sense. Why would a group of experienced hikers in the middle of a freezing night slice open their only shelter and run out into a blizzard without proper clothing or footwear? Investigators at the scene were baffled. The placement of the tent itself was questionable. It was pitched on an open slope exposed to the full force of the wind, rather than in the more sheltered forest line just a mile away. It was a decision that seemed to contradict the fundamental principles of mountaineering that Igor Dyatlov and his group would have known so well. From the tent, a set of footprints led down the slope, heading towards the woods. Investigators were able to distinguish 8 or 9 sets of tracks, made by people wearing only socks, a single boot, or even completely barefoot. The prints were orderly at first, suggesting the group had left together, walking calmly side by side. But the calmness did not last. The tracks continued for about a third of a mile before they disappeared under the snow. The direction they took was away from the logical path back to their previous camp or any form of civilization. They were heading deeper into the danger, not away from it, into the dark and foreboding tree line. The first bodies were found the following day at the edge of the nearby forest, beneath a large ancient cedar tree. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were dressed only in their underwear. Beside them were the remains of a small fire. The branches of the cedar tree above them were broken up to a height of 15 feet, suggesting that someone had desperately tried to climb it, perhaps to get a better view or to escape from something on the ground. The 2 men had died of hypothermia, but the scene was disturbing. It was a desperate, failed attempt to survive against an unknown threat that had driven them from their tent. Over the next few days, 3 more bodies were discovered between the cedar tree and the tent site. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin were found at different distances, their bodies oriented as if they had been trying to make their way back up the treacherous slope to the abandoned tent. They too had succumbed to the freezing temperatures, but their determined postures told a story of a desperate final struggle. They had not simply given up, they had fought to survive, yet the question loomed larger and more terrifying than ever. What were they fighting against, and where were the other 4 hikers? The search would continue for 2 more months before the final, most disturbing discoveries were made. Every great adventure begins with a dream, a spark of ambition in the hearts of those who dare to explore the unknown. For the Dyatlov group, this dream was forged in the halls of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, a crucible of bright young minds in the industrial city of Sverdlovsk. They were not just students, they were members of the Institute's vibrant hiking club, a community bound by a shared passion for the raw, untamed beauty of their homeland's wilderness. This expedition was to be the pinnacle of their achievements, a testament to their skill, endurance, and camaraderie. Their goal was Otorten Mountain, a remote peak in the northern Urals, a challenge that promised both breathtaking vistas and formidable obstacles. It was a journey into the heart of winter, a quest for the ultimate prize in Soviet mountaineering, a Category 3 certification. The designation of Category 3 was not given lightly. It was the highest and most difficult classification for a winter sports trek, reserved only for the most experienced and physically prepared hikers. The route would cover over 300 kilometers of punishing terrain, through dense forests, over frozen rivers, and across windswept mountain passes where the weather could turn lethal in an instant. The group understood the risks involved. They were meticulous in their preparations, studying maps, planning their food rations, and ensuring their equipment was in perfect order. They were a collective of seasoned individuals, each having proven their mettle on previous, less demanding expeditions. They felt ready, confident in their abilities and in the strength of their bond to see them through the harshest conditions. The team was a mosaic of personalities, a blend of youthful exuberance and quiet determination. They were engineers, physicists, and students, united by a love for the outdoors that transcended their academic pursuits. In the days leading up to their departure, an air of excitement buzzed around them. Their diaries and letters home were filled with anticipation for the grand adventure that lay ahead. They spoke of the majestic beauty of the Urals and the thrill of testing their limits against the power of nature. They were on the cusp of an experience that would define them, little knowing that their journey would become a story told not of triumph, but of enduring, terrifying mystery that would forever haunt the silent slopes of the mountains they so longed to conquer. This expedition was more than just a physical challenge, it was a spiritual one. It was an escape from the rigid structure of Soviet life, a chance to find freedom in the vast open wilderness. The mountains offered a sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves, reliant only on their skills and each other. Their shared purpose created an unbreakable fellowship, a small, self-sufficient family venturing into the unknown. They carried with them not just backpacks and skis, but the hopes and dreams of a generation eager to explore the frontiers of their world. This was the spirit of the Dyatlov expedition, a bold, optimistic push into the heart of the wild, a final, poignant expression of their vibrant lives before the silence fell. Igor Dyatlov, just 23, was the group's quiet, meticulous leader, trusted, respected, and always prepared. He planned every detail, from route to rations, and even built a custom stove for warmth. Dyatlov's journals and photographs, later recovered, reveal a leader dedicated to both safety and the spirit of adventure. Yet his final decision, to camp on an exposed slope, remains a baffling contradiction, fueling the enduring mystery of the tragedy. Zinaida Kolmogorova and Lyudmila Dubinina were not just along for the ride. They were strong, skilled, and vital to the team. Zina's determination and Lyudmila's resilience inspired the group, their diaries and photos capturing both joy and grit. Their tragic ends, Zina's desperate crawl, Lyudmila's horrific injuries, stand in stark contrast to their vibrant spirits. Their stories remain a poignant reminder of the lives lost in the Dyatlov Pass mystery. The group's backbone was its steadfast young men, Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, Slobodin, and Kolovatov, each bringing strength, skill, and camaraderie. Their unity is evident in photos and journals, building fires, repairing gear, facing the elements together. In the end, their desperate fight for survival, side by side, only deepens the tragedy and the enigma. What force could shatter such a capable, resilient team? Semyon Zolotaryov, the outsider, older, a war veteran and shrouded in mystery, joined the group at the last minute. His experience and cheerful demeanor masked a murky past, fueling theories of secret missions and hidden motives. Found with massive internal injuries and cryptic tattoos, Zolotaryov's fate is central to the most enduring conspiracies. Was he a target, or simply another victim of the unknown terror that claimed them all? Yuri Yudin, plagued by illness, turned back early, unwittingly saving his life. Haunted by survivor's guilt, he spent years searching for answers, forever marked by the loss of his friends. His story is a somber counterpoint, a life spared but shadowed by tragedy. The Dyatlov Pass mystery endures, with Yuri as its lone living witness. The last days of the Dyatlov group's journey are preserved in a time capsule of black and white photographs and handwritten diary entries. These artifacts, recovered from the abandoned tent, offer a precious and poignant window into their final, unsuspecting moments. They paint a picture not of impending doom, but of youthful optimism and resilience in the face of nature's challenges. The group's collective diary, passed between several members, chronicles their steady progress. The entries are filled with mundane details of daily life on the trail, the kilometers they skied, the food they ate, and the jokes they shared. There is a light-heartedness to their writing, a sense of adventure that shows no hint of fear or distress. The photographs echo this sentiment of normalcy and camaraderie. They show the group skiing through vast, sunlit fields of snow, their faces bright with effort and excitement. There are images of them building a traditional Mansi storage platform or labaz to lighten their packs for the final ascent to Otorten. In one series of photos, they are seen playfully posing and laughing, clearly enjoying each other's company despite the harsh conditions. One of the last photos taken shows several members diligently digging into a deep snowbank to erect their tent on the evening of February 1st. It is a scene of routine and collaboration, capturing a team working together, completely unaware that this would be their final act. The final entry in the group diary, dated January 31st, describes their arrival at the edge of the highland area. They speak of the worsening weather with strong winds and decreasing visibility, but their tone remains confident. They made the decision to set up the labaz and prepare for the final push. "We are starting to get tired," the entry reads. "It's time to start setting up the tent." The next day, February 1st, they began to move through the pass, but the deteriorating weather likely forced them to deviate from their planned route, leading them to make camp on the exposed slope of Kolatsyakl. This was a fateful decision, but their records give no indication that it was made out of panic or fear. This period of documented innocence makes the events that followed all the more shocking and inexplicable. Within hours of these last diary entries and photographs, something went catastrophically wrong. The calm, competent group of hikers was transformed into a terrified mass of people fleeing for their lives. The stark contrast between the documented reality of their final days and the bizarre, violent evidence left at the scene is the central paradox of the Dyatlov Pass incident. The journals and photos are the last testaments of their living selves, a final heartbreaking glimpse of their vibrant spirits before they were consumed by an unknown terror that descended upon them in the dead of the Ural night. The journey into the heart of the Ural wilderness began in the small, snow-dusted logging town of Vizhai. This was the final outpost of civilization, the last point of contact with the outside world before the group would be completely reliant on their own skills and provisions. On January 26th, the hikers arrived by truck, their spirits buoyed by the crisp winter air and the promise of the great adventure ahead. Vizhai was a rugged, remote settlement, a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the harsh seasons and the vast surrounding forest. For the Dyatlov group, it was the gateway to their ambition, the starting line for their grueling 300-kilometer trek. They spent their last night under a solid roof, enjoying the warmth and camaraderie, sharing songs and stories in anticipation of the trail. The atmosphere was one of palpable excitement. The hikers bought last-minute supplies, including fresh bread, and spent time mingling with the locals, who were a mix of loggers and indigenous Mansi people. The group was a curiosity, their modern equipment and youthful energy a stark contrast to the rugged, weather-beaten faces of the town's inhabitants. The photographs from this time show them smiling, full of confidence, posing with their heavy backpacks and skis. Their diaries speak of this final contact with society, with a sense of cheerful farewell, eager to leave the constraints of the town behind and immerse themselves in the pure, untamed beauty of the mountains that loomed on the horizon, beckoning them forward into the unknown. The following morning, January 27th, they bid farewell to the relative comforts of Vizhai. They hired an open-top truck to take them further along a logging road to a settlement known as the 41st Kvartal, the final inhabited point on their map. The ride was cold and bumpy, but their spirits remained high. They sang songs to keep warm, their voices carrying over the rumble of the engine and the crunch of snow beneath the tires. This was the true beginning of their isolation, the moment they crossed the threshold from the known world into a landscape governed by the ancient and unforgiving laws of nature. Each kilometer took them deeper into the wilderness, further from help and closer to their destiny. It was during this phase of the journey that the group's dynamic truly solidified. Igor Dyatlov's leadership was quiet but firm, ensuring every detail was in order. The others fell into their roles naturally, a well-oiled machine of shared labor and mutual support. They were a self-contained unit, a small tribe venturing into a vast empty land. They documented everything with their cameras and journals, capturing the stark beauty of the snow-laden fir trees and the vast white silence that was beginning to envelop them. These early days were filled with a sense of purpose and a profound connection to the wilderness. An innocent and optimistic start to a journey that would soon take a dark and inexplicable turn. As the Dyatlov group ventured deeper into the territory, they were entering the ancestral lands of the Mansi people, an indigenous community with a deep spiritual connection to the Ural Mountains. For centuries, The Mansi have lived a nomadic life of hunting and reindeer herding, their culture and folklore intricately woven into the very landscape the hikers sought to conquer. The mountains were not just physical formations to them, they were sacred spaces, home to powerful spirits and ancient legends. The peaks and valleys had names that carried meaning, often serving as warnings to those who did not understand the land's power. The hikers, with their scientific and athletic approach to the wilderness, were outsiders in this world of myth and spirit. The destination they aimed for, Ural Mountain, is a name that has been subject to much debate. While some translate it from the Mansi language as "don't go there," this is likely a misinterpretation that has added to the mythos of the incident. However, the nearby mountain where the tragedy occurred, Kolatsiakul, has a much more chilling and undisputed translation, Dead Mountain. According to Mansi folklore, this name is linked to a legend of 9 Mansi hunters who perished on its slopes long ago, giving the area a reputation as a place of bad fortune. Another legend speaks of a great flood that killed 9 shamans on the mountain. These stories were part of the local oral tradition, whispers on the winter wind that warned of the mountain's malevolent nature. During their investigation, Soviet authorities interviewed local Mansi people, initially suspecting they might have been involved in the hikers' deaths. The theory was that the students might have trespassed on a sacred site, provoking a violent response. However, this line of inquiry was quickly dismissed. The investigators found no evidence of any hostility. In fact, the Mansi were known to be peaceful and would have had no reason to attack the group. Furthermore, the nature of the hikers' injuries was not consistent with a human assault, and there were no tracks other than their own found near the tent. The Mansi themselves were mystified by the event, attributing it to powerful, malevolent spirits they believed inhabited the area. Although the Mansi were cleared of any wrongdoing, their connection to the land adds a layer of cultural and folkloric depth to the mystery. Their beliefs offer an alternative lens through which to view the incident, one that steps outside the bounds of rational scientific explanation. For them, the force that drove the hikers from their tent was not something that could be measured or analyzed by modern science. It was an ancient power inherent to the mountain itself. Whether one views these legends as superstition or as a form of ancestral knowledge, the ominous name Dead Mountain and the local folklore surrounding it cast a long, dark shadow over the entire Dyatlov Pass incident. As the expedition pressed on, the physical demands of the journey began to take their toll. The hikers were carrying heavy packs, each loaded with approximately 50 pounds of food, equipment, and personal belongings. To succeed in their goal of summiting Ural Mountain, they needed to be faster and more agile. Following standard procedure for such expeditions, Igor Dyatlov made the decision to construct a labaz, a raised, covered storage cache for a portion of their supplies. This would allow them to leave behind non-essential food and equipment, travel lighter for the final ascent, and retrieve the items on their return journey. The construction of the labaz was a crucial and strategic part of their plan. On January 31st, in a wooded valley at the base of the highlands, the group found a suitable location and began their work. The task required teamwork and significant effort. They dug a deep pit in the snow, lined it with skis, and carefully placed their surplus food and gear inside. This included items like oatmeal, sugar, and spare boots, provisions that would be vital for their trek back to civilization. They then covered the cache with wood and blankets, piling snow on top to camouflage it from animals and insulate it from the cold. The entire process was documented in their diaries and photographs, showing a team working efficiently and in good spirits, confident in their plan and their ability to see it through. The creation of the labaz is a critical piece of evidence that speaks volumes about the group's state of mind just before the incident. It demonstrates that they were thinking clearly, acting rationally, and planning for the future. They fully intended to return to that spot after their successful ascent of Ural. There was no indication of panic, haste, or any sense of impending doom. The Labaz was an act of hope and foresight, a testament to their belief that they would complete their journey as planned. This makes the events that unfolded just 2 days later all the more baffling and contradictory. Why would a group so focused on their future survival suddenly abandon all logic? When search parties eventually discovered the intact Labaz weeks later, it only deepened the mystery. The cache was untouched, a silent monument to the group's final, unfulfilled plans. The fact that the hikers, in their desperate flight from the tent, made no attempt to reach the Labaz is profoundly perplexing. It was located only about 1.5 miles from their final campsite, a known location of life-sustaining food and warmer gear. Their decision to flee in the opposite direction, down the slope towards the sparse tree line, defies all survival instincts. The Labaz remains a powerful symbol of their intentions, a stark contradiction to their final frantic actions. After securing their surplus supplies in the Labaz, the Dyatlov group began the most arduous phase of their journey, the ascent into the exposed, windswept highlands. On the morning of February 1st, they left the relative shelter of the Uspia River Valley and began to climb toward the pass that lay between them and Otorta Mountain. The weather, which had been manageable until this point, began to turn against them. The wind picked up, howling across the open slopes and whipping snow into the air, drastically reducing visibility. The temperature plummeted and the landscape transformed into a disorienting sea of white. The easy camaraderie of the trail gave way to a grim, determined struggle against the elements. The hikers were now in a completely exposed environment with no trees to offer protection from the relentless wind. Their progress slowed significantly as they battled the storm. Each step forward was an act of will, a fight against the biting cold and the force of the gale. Diary entries from the previous day had already mentioned the strong westerly wind, but what they faced now was likely far worse, a classic Ural blizzard that could materialize with frightening speed. This was the moment where their experience and endurance were being tested to their absolute limits. They were seasoned hikers, but even the most skilled mountaineer is vulnerable in the face of nature's full untempered fury. According to investigators who reconstructed their path from the faint ski tracks, the group likely became disoriented in the whiteout conditions. They had intended to cross the pass and descend to a more sheltered area on the other side to make camp. However, the storm seems to have pushed them off course, causing them to veer west and begin ascending the slope of Kolatsiakl, or Dead Mountain. This was a critical navigational error, but an understandable one given the extreme weather. As evening approached, exhausted and battered by the storm, they faced a difficult choice. Push on in the fading light and worsening conditions, or make camp where they were on the exposed, inhospitable slope. This struggle against the storm is a key factor in understanding the events that followed. The physical and mental exhaustion of the group must have been immense. They had spent hours fighting their way up the mountain, their bodies drained of energy, and their minds focused on simple survival. This state of extreme fatigue could have impaired their judgment, potentially contributing to the decision to pitch their tent in such a dangerous location. The ascent was more than just a climb. It was a battle. It was a final, grueling test of their strength and resolve before they settled in for what should have been a night of rest, a night that would instead become their last. As dusk began to settle on the evening of February 1st, the 9 exhausted hikers made a decision that has been debated and analyzed for over 60 years. Instead of retreating back down the slope to the safety of the forest line, which was only about 1 mile away, they chose to pitch their tent on the open, exposed eastern slope of Kolatsiakl. This decision was a stark departure from standard mountaineering practice. An experienced leader like Igor Dyatlov would have known that camping on a barren slope in the path of a potential storm was incredibly risky. The forest offered shelter from the wind, a ready supply of firewood, and a much safer environment for a winter camp. Why did they make such a perplexing choice? One theory suggests it was a matter of pride and training. Dyatlov may have wanted to practice camping on a high open slope as a drill for the tough conditions they would face later in the expedition. It was a way to test their skills and acclimatize to the harsh environment. Another possibility is that they were simply too exhausted from their battle with the storm to retreat. Making their way back down the mountain in the fading light and whiteout conditions might have seemed more dangerous than staying put. They may have believed their sturdy tent and new stove would be sufficient to see them through the night, underestimating the ferocity of the Ural weather. Regardless of the reason, the placement of the tent was their final strategic act as a cohesive group. The photographs recovered from their cameras show them working together to dig into the deep snow, creating a platform to protect the tent from the wind. The scene is one of routine and competence, not of panic. They went about their tasks with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this many times before. They were preparing for a night of rest to recuperate their strength for the journey ahead. Inside the tent, they would have prepared a meal, written in their diaries, and settled in for the night, seeking refuge from the storm that raged outside. This decision, however logical or illogical it may have seemed at the time, placed them in a position of extreme vulnerability. Isolated on the barren mountainside, they were at the mercy of the elements and whatever else lurked in the darkness of that frozen night. The location itself became a crucial part of the mystery. Had they camped in the forest, their story might have had a different ending. But on that open slope, they were a tiny, fragile island of humanity in a vast and unforgiving wilderness. It was a fateful choice that set the stage for the terror that was to come, a decision that sealed their doom in a way they could never have foreseen. Among the rolls of film recovered from the abandoned tent, one frame really stands out as particularly enigmatic and, honestly, pretty chilling. It's believed to be the final photograph ever taken by a member of the Dyatlov group. The image itself is blurry, poorly composed, and seems to have been taken in low light, which suggests it was snapped in a moment of haste or confusion. It appears to have been taken from within the tent, looking out at the dark, snowy landscape beyond. The photo shows several indistinct orange orbs or streaks of light against a dark background. The nature of these lights is highly ambiguous, and their significance, if there is any, remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. The photograph is often presented by proponents of supernatural or military-related theories as well supposed proof of an external anomalous event. They argue that the lights could be the headlights of a vehicle, the glow of a secret military flare, or even the manifestation of an unexplained aerial phenomenon, often referred to as a UFO. According to this interpretation, the photo captures the very thing that caused the hikers to panic and flee their tent. It's seen as the last desperate act of a person trying to document the source of their terror before being overwhelmed by it. The image's poor quality only adds to its mystique, allowing for a wide range of frightening possibilities to be projected onto its grainy surface. However, skeptical analysts offer a much more mundane explanation for the mysterious final frame. They suggest that the photo is nothing more than an accidental shot taken unintentionally as the camera was being handled or put away inside the tent. The orbs could simply be the light from a flashlight, a candle, or the group's stove flame, distorted by the movement of the camera and the slow shutter speed in the low light conditions. It could even be the result of the film being accidentally exposed to light as the camera was unloaded by another member of the group. From this perspective, the photograph is a random, meaningless artifact that's only been imbued with sinister significance in hindsight. Ultimately, the last photograph remains an unsolvable piece of the puzzle. It's sort of a Rorschach test for the Dyatlov incident. What one sees in its blurry shapes often reflects their own preconceived theories about the case. It could be the key to the entire mystery, a final, fleeting glimpse of the horror the hikers faced. Or it could be a complete red herring, just an accidental artifact that distracts from more plausible explanations. Like so much of the evidence in this case, the final photograph offers no clear answers. Instead, it hangs in the air, a ghostly and ambiguous image that captures the profound uncertainty and enduring mystery of the group's final, terrifying moments on Dead Mountain. Sometime during the late hours of February 1st or the early morning of February 2nd, the routine of the expedition was, well, shattered. The laughter, the diary entries, and the methodical preparations for the next day came to an abrupt and violent end. The ordinary sounds of a camp settling in for the night, the whisper of the stove, the rustle of sleeping bags, the murmur of conversation, were replaced by something else, something terrifying enough to instill a primal, overwhelming fear in 9 experienced and rational individuals. This was the moment the journey ended and the incident began. This was the moment the silence fell over Kolatsiakl, a silence that would not be broken for weeks. What transpired inside that tent will forever be a matter of speculation. The physical evidence tells a chilling story. The tent was sliced open from the inside, a desperate act of escape. The hikers fled without their boots, their coats, or their survival gear, abandoning their only source of shelter and warmth. They ran out into a blizzard with temperatures plummeting to as low as -30 degrees Celsius, about -22 Fahrenheit. This was not a logical evacuation. It was a blind, panicked flight. The force that triggered this terror must have been immediate, overwhelming, and perceived as more dangerous than the lethal cold that awaited them outside. It was a threat that negated all their training, all their experience, and their most basic survival instincts. The timeline of their intended journey now began to stretch into an ominous void. The group had planned to send a telegram from the village of Vijay by February 12th at the latest. When that day came and went with no word, the first seeds of concern were planted back home. In the vast, silent wilderness, the hikers were now officially missing. The world continued on, unaware that 9 vibrant young people were already dead, their bodies lying frozen and scattered across a remote mountainside. The silence from the Dyatlov group was no longer just the absence of a message. It was a profound and unsettling emptiness that grew heavier with each passing day. This silence marks the transition from a documented adventure to an enduring enigma. Up until this point, we have their diaries, their photos, and a clear trail of their progress. But from the moment they cut their way out of the tent, their story descends into a realm of terrifying uncertainty. We're left only with the aftermath. The abandoned tent, the scattered bodies, and a collection of bizarre and contradictory clues. The journey that had begun with such hope and excitement had reached its final, tragic destination, not on the summit of Otorten, but in the heart of an inexplicable mystery on the slopes of Dead Mountain, where the questions would forever echo in the howling wind. The calendar pages turned and the dates circled in anticipation. February 12th arrived with an unnerving silence. This was the day Igor Dyatlov was scheduled to send a telegram from Vijay, the small village that marked the end of their arduous trek. It was meant to be a simple message of triumph. We have succeeded, we are safe. But the telegram never came. In Sverdlovsk at the Ural Polytechnic Institute Sports Club, the initial lack of news was met with calculated patience rather than immediate alarm. Delays were a common feature of such demanding winter expeditions. A sudden blizzard, difficult terrain, or a minor injury could easily add a few days to the itinerary. Dyatlov himself had mentioned the possibility of a slight delay before he left, a casual remark that now served to temper the rising tide of worry. As the days continued to pass, however, this calm patience began to fray at the edges, slowly eroding into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. The families of the hikers, initially reassured by the sports club, found their reassurances wearing thin. The silence from the mountains felt vast and oppressive. Each passing day without word made the optimistic scenarios less plausible and the darker possibilities more vivid. By the 15th, then the 16th, a consensus was growing among the relatives and fellow students. Something was wrong. This was not a typical delay. A group as disciplined and well-led as Dyatlov's would have found a way to send word if they were able. The complete and utter lack of communication was deeply uncharacteristic and profoundly unsettling. The sports club, still hesitant to launch a full-scale search, faced increasing pressure from the families. They had seen many groups return late, and the cost and complexity of a search and rescue operation in the remote northern Urals were immense. They held on to the hope that the hikers would emerge from the wilderness at any moment, tired and weathered, but safe. This period of waiting became a torturous limbo for the loved ones left behind. They were caught between hope and fear, scanning maps of the region, imagining the brutal conditions their children and friends were facing. The vast, indifferent expanse of the Ural Mountains, once a symbol of adventure, now seemed like a menacing entity, holding the 9 hikers captive in its silent, frozen grip. Finally, as the silence stretched towards a week past the deadline, the weight of uncertainty became unbearable. The families' pleas grew more desperate, their fears too potent to be ignored any longer. The official inaction could not continue. The persistent and organized lobbying from the students and relatives of the missing hikers finally broke through the bureaucratic inertia. The sports club and the institute authorities had to concede that the situation was potentially grave. The long, agonizing wait was over, but it was to be replaced by a new phase of dread. The official search for the 9 missing souls who had walked into the wilderness and vanished without a trace. The incident was about to move from a private worry to a public crisis. The primary catalyst for the official search operation was, honestly, the relentless determination of the hikers' families. Among them, the father of Lyudmila Dubinina was particularly influential, using his position and connections to demand action from the authorities. The collective voice of the parents, amplified by the concerned students of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, created a chorus of alarm that could no longer be dismissed as mere overreaction. They organized, they wrote letters, and they made phone calls, just refusing to let their children be forgotten in the vast, snowy expanse. Their fear was a powerful force, cutting through the red tape and compelling the regional party officials to finally acknowledge the gravity of the situation and mobilize the necessary resources for a comprehensive search. On February 20th, nearly 2 weeks after the hikers were due back, the first official search and rescue mission was formally launched. The scale of the undertaking was significant, reflecting the seriousness with which the disappearance was now being treated. The operation was a joint effort involving volunteer students and teachers from the institute, local Mansi hunters who knew the terrain intimately, and crucially the Soviet army and militia, or police force. The involvement of the military brought with it essential resources, including airplanes and helicopters, which would be vital for surveying the immense and largely inaccessible search area. The mission was no longer a civilian affair, it was a state-level emergency. The initial search parties were composed of the hikers' peers, friends and fellow members of the Institute's hiking club. These volunteers were driven by a desperate hope of finding their friends alive. They were young, strong, and familiar with the rigors of the Ural winter, but the emotional weight of their task was immense. They were not just looking for missing persons, they were looking for their friends, their comrades from other expeditions. They packed their skis and supplies with heavy hearts, their minds filled with a mixture of grim determination and agonizing worry. As they set out, they followed the group's intended route, a path laid out on a map that now felt like a guide into a heart of darkness. The aerial search began immediately, with small planes and helicopters crisscrossing the skies above the northern Urals. From the air, the landscape was a daunting, monotonous panorama of white. The pilots and observers scanned the endless forests and mountainsides for any sign of life, any splash of color that might indicate the presence of the missing group. A tent, a campfire, or even just a piece of discarded equipment. For days, their efforts yielded nothing. The vastness of the wilderness seemed to have swallowed the 9 hikers whole, leaving no clue as to their whereabouts. The initial optimism of the search teams began to fade with each fruitless flight, replaced by a growing sense of foreboding as the silent mountains refused to give up their secrets. The ground search was a grueling and methodical process, a slow crawl through an unforgiving environment. The volunteer teams, mostly students who knew the missing hikers personally, were divided into several groups, each assigned to a specific sector of the vast search area. They moved on skis, pulling sleds laden with supplies, retracing the path they believed the Dyatlov group would have taken. The weather was brutal, with biting winds and temperatures that remained far below freezing. The searchers faced the same harsh conditions that their friends had encountered, gaining a grim, first-hand appreciation for the formidable power of the Ural winter. Every step was a battle against the cold, the deep snow, and their own mounting despair. The teams focused their efforts along the Auspia River, the valley the group was known to have followed before their planned ascent towards Ototen mountain. They scanned the snow for any sign of ski tracks, a broken branch or a discarded wrapper, anything that might indicate the group had passed that way. For several days, their search was fruitless. The heavy snowfall that had occurred since the group's disappearance had blanketed the landscape, erasing most traces of their passage. The silence of the forest was broken only by the crunch of their own skis and the sound of their calls for their friends, which echoed unanswered through the desolate, snow-laden trees. The hope of finding them alive dwindled with each passing hour. The involvement of local Mansi hunters provided invaluable expertise. Their intimate knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, allowed them to spot subtle signs that the student volunteers might have missed. They understood the patterns of the wind and snow, and they knew the paths of animal trails that could sometimes be mistaken for human tracks. Despite their skills, even the Mansi found the search incredibly difficult. The area was vast, and the lack of any clear trail was baffling. They joined the effort with a somber understanding of the dangers of the region, their ancestral folklore about the malevolent spirits of Dead Mountain, perhaps lending a superstitious weight to their grim task. As the days turned into a week, the frustration and exhaustion of the search parties grew. The aerial reconnaissance had spotted nothing of significance, and the ground teams had found no definitive trail. The morale was low, and the terrible possibility that they might never find their friends or find them too late loomed large. The search area was enormous, and they were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they pressed on, driven by loyalty and a slim, fading glimmer of hope. It was this persistence that would finally lead to a breakthrough, a discovery that would mark the beginning of the end of the search and the start of a mystery that would endure for decades. The breakthrough came on February 26th, more than 3 weeks after the hikers had last been seen. A pilot from the civilian air fleet flying a reconnaissance mission spotted something dark and out of place against the vast white canvas of the mountainside. It was on the eastern slope of Kolat-Syakhl, a mountain whose name, Dead Mountain, would soon take on a terrifying new resonance. The pilot, Mikhail Sharavin, radioed the coordinates to the ground teams. A group of volunteer searchers, led by a student named Boris Sloptsov, was diverted to the location. As they skied closer, their hearts pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They were about to find the first concrete clue in the week-long search. As the search party crested a ridge, they saw it clearly. A single canvas tent, half buried and battered by the wind. It was immediately recognizable as the Dyatlov group's tent. The sight was deeply confusing. The tent was pitched on a barren, open slope, fully exposed to the elements, a highly unusual and dangerous choice for experienced hikers. A nearby forest, just a mile down the slope, would have offered much better protection. A profound sense of unease settled over the searchers as they approached the silent, lonely structure. The tent was collapsed and covered in a thick layer of snow, suggesting it had been abandoned for some time. There were no signs of life around it. With careful movements, the searchers began to dig away the snow. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The tent had been violently damaged, but not in a way they expected. It had been slashed and cut open, and the cuts were clearly made from the inside. It was as if the occupants had been in such a desperate hurry to get out that they hadn't even taken the time to use the entrance. This single shocking detail painted a picture of sudden, inexplicable panic. What could have been so terrifying that it would cause 9 seasoned hikers to destroy their only shelter and flee into the deadly cold of a Ural winter night? The scene was eerily quiet. The wind howled across the slope, but there were no other sounds. The hikers themselves were nowhere to be seen. The search party called out their names, their voices swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. There was no reply. The abandoned tent stood as a silent, baffling testament to a moment of pure terror. The search for the missing hikers had reached a critical turning point. They had found the group's last known location, but instead of answers, they had only found a host of new, more frightening questions. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass had officially begun. Once the snow was cleared away from the entrance, the searchers cautiously peered inside the abandoned tent. The scene that greeted them was one of eerie, organized chaos. It was as if the occupants had been in the middle of their evening routine when they were suddenly and violently interrupted. All of the group's belongings were still inside, neatly arranged in their designated places. Backpacks were lined up, and warm clothes, including jackets, sweaters, and spare trousers, were folded and ready for use. Their boots were lined up near the entrance, a detail that was particularly chilling as it suggested the hikers had fled into the deep snow without proper footwear. The provisions for their next meal were laid out as if in preparation for dinner. Slices of salo or cured pork fat were ready to be eaten, and flasks were filled, though their contents were now frozen solid. The group's personal effects, diaries, cameras, and even money were left untouched. This was not the scene of a robbery or an attack by outsiders. It was a scene of sudden, panicked abandonment. The presence of all their survival gear, from warm clothing to food and axes, made their flight into the sub-zero wilderness an act of utter desperation, a choice that seemed to defy all logic and instinct for self-preservation. Among the items recovered was the group's main diary, which documented their journey up until the final day. The last entry was dated January 31st, describing their preparations for the final ascent. They also found a satirical propaganda newspaper the group had created themselves, called the Evening Autorten, dated February 1st. Its tone was light-hearted and humorous, showing absolutely no sign of distress or fear. This artifact provided a haunting glimpse into the group's mindset just hours before the catastrophe, a stark contrast to the terror that must have followed. The calm normalcy of their final documented hours made the violent chaos of their escape all the more incomprehensible. Investigators who later examined the site were completely baffled. The scene presented a series of profound contradictions. Why leave behind all the tools necessary for survival? Why cut your way out of a tent when the entrance was unobstructed? And what could possibly constitute a threat so immediate and terrifying that facing a blizzard barefoot was the preferable option? The abandoned tent was the epicenter of the mystery, a silent stage where the first act of an unimaginable tragedy had played out. The clues it offered were strange and disturbing, pointing not towards a simple hiking accident, but towards an event of profound and terrifying strangeness that had occurred on the desolate slope of Dead Mountain. Stepping back from the eerie silence of the abandoned tent, the search party made another crucial discovery. Leading away from the damaged shelter, heading down the slope towards the distant tree line, was a set of footprints in the snow. The tracks were a ghostly record of the group's final desperate moments. Investigators who were later brought to the scene were able to analyze this trail before it was erased by the wind and new snow. The prints told a story that was both orderly and chaotic, a narrative of a group moving together in a state of controlled panic. There were 8 or 9 distinct sets of tracks, confirming that the entire group had left the tent at the same time. The most shocking detail about the footprints was what they revealed about the hikers' state of dress. The impressions in the snow were clearly made by people wearing only socks, thin woolen slippers, or in some cases nothing at all. Only one set of prints seemed to be from a single boot. The idea of anyone, let alone experienced mountaineers, running barefoot into the deep snow and brutal cold of a Ural winter night was almost impossible to fathom. It spoke of a terror so profound that it overrode the most basic human instinct to protect oneself from the elements. They were fleeing something, but the tracks showed no signs of pursuit. There were no other footprints, no animal tracks, and no evidence of a struggle near the tent. For the first 500 meters, the tracks indicated that the group moved in a relatively orderly fashion. They walked, not ran, side by side in a line, as if being deliberately escorted or marching with a unified purpose. This strange calmness at the beginning of their flight is one of the most puzzling aspects of the incident. It suggests that their initial departure from the tent was not a wild, mindless scramble, but a coordinated, if panicked, retreat. What could compel a group to walk calmly barefoot into a deathly cold blizzard? This part of the trail deepens the mystery, adding a layer of eerie intentionality to their otherwise illogical actions. After this initial stretch, the tracks became more scattered, suggesting the group had begun to separate and lose cohesion as they neared the relative shelter of the forest's edge. The trail of footprints eventually disappeared, buried under the snow that had fallen in the intervening weeks. However, they had pointed the way for the searchers, leading them down the mountain towards the next grim discovery. The footprints were like a spectral pathway, the last physical trace of the hiker's conscious journey. They were the tracks of barefoot ghosts, leading away from a scene of inexplicable terror and deeper into the heart of the unfolding tragedy that awaited the searchers in the woods below. Following the direction indicated by the vanishing footprints, the search party made their way down the slope to the edge of the forest, about a mile from the abandoned tent. There, under the sprawling branches of a large ancient cedar tree, they found the first of their missing friends. The scene was grim and deeply disturbing. Lying side by side in the snow were the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonichenko. They were stripped down to their underwear, their bodies frozen solid. The discovery confirmed the searchers' worst fears. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery operation, and the story of what happened was growing darker and more bizarre with every new finding. Beside the two bodies were the charred remains of a small, hastily built fire. It was clear that the two men had desperately tried to fight off the lethal cold. The evidence of their struggle was all around them. The lower branches of the great cedar tree above them were broken and snapped up to a height of nearly 15 feet. This suggested that one or both of them had frantically tried to climb the tree, perhaps to get a better vantage point, to look for the tent, or to escape from something on the ground below. Their hands were scraped and raw, a testament to their desperate, final efforts to survive against an unknown threat in the terrifying darkness. The official cause of death for both Doroshenko and Krivonichenko was determined to be hypothermia. They had simply frozen to death, but the circumstances were anything but simple. Why were they in such a state of undress? The theory of paradoxical undressing, a known phenomenon where hypothermia victims feel a sensation of intense heat and remove their clothes, could offer a partial explanation. However, it does not account for what drove them from the tent in the first place, or why they were unable to build a more substantial life-sustaining fire, despite being surrounded by ample firewood. The small, pathetic fire suggested their efforts were brief and panicked. The discovery under the cedar tree raised more questions than it answered. It was a scene of a desperate, failed last stand. The two Yuris had fought hard for their lives, but they were overwhelmed. Their position, a full mile from the life-saving gear in their tent, was a fatal one. The sight of their bodies, combined with the evidence of their frantic activity, painted a horrifying picture of their final hours. They had survived the initial flight from the tent, only to succumb to the brutal cold at the edge of the woods. The searchers now had a new, grim task: to find the remaining 7 hikers, knowing they were likely scattered somewhere between this tragic scene and the abandoned camp on the slope above. With the discovery of the 2 bodies under the cedar tree, the search really intensified in the area between the woods and the abandoned tent. The searchers fanned out, meticulously probing the deep snow along the slope. It was here that they found the next 3 members of the Dyatlov group. The bodies of Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin were discovered at different points along a line that seemed to lead from the cedar tree back up towards the tent. Their position suggested a final desperate attempt to return to the only shelter they had. A heroic but ultimately futile struggle against the overwhelming odds of the storm and the freezing cold. Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, was found about 300 meters from the cedar tree, his body lying face up in the snow. He was clutching a single birch branch, his other arm raised as if to shield his face. His posture was one of defiance, as though he had been fighting his way up the hill until his last breath. A little further up the slope, they found Zinaida Kolmogorova. She was closer to the tent than anyone else, having made it the farthest in her desperate return journey. Her body showed signs of a brutal struggle, with abrasions on her face and hands, indicating she had been crawling through the ice and snow when she finally succumbed to exhaustion and cold. The third body found in this area was that of Rustem Slobodin, lying between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova. Like the others, he had died of hypothermia, but a later examination would reveal he had a small fracture in his skull. The three of them were better dressed than the pair found by the cedar tree, but they still lacked adequate protection against the elements. Their determined, tragic climb back up the slope tells a powerful story. It suggests that after the initial panic subsided, at least some members of the group regained their composure and understood that their only hope for survival lay back in the tent. They had fought against the wind and the deep snow, a final act of courage in the face of certain death. The discovery of these three bodies only deepened the central enigma of the incident. If they were rational enough to attempt to return to the tent, why had they fled in such a panicked, irrational manner in the first place? Their valiant effort to correct their fatal mistake makes their initial flight all the more baffling. By the end of February, 5 of the 9 hikers had been found, all victims of hypothermia, but the fate of the remaining 4 was still unknown. The search would continue for 2 more months before the spring thaw would reveal the final, most disturbing chapter of the Dyatlov Pass incident, hidden deep within a snowy ravine. For more than 2 long and agonizing months, the fate of the remaining 4 hikers, Lyudmila Dubinaina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles remained a complete mystery. The initial search had recovered 5 bodies, all of whom had officially perished from hypothermia. While the circumstances were bizarre, the cause of death was straightforward. As winter maintained its icy grip on the Ural Mountains, the search efforts were hampered by meters of deep, compacted snow. The search parties continued their grim work, probing the vast, silent landscape with long metal rods, hoping for a sign. But the mountains held their secrets fast, buried beneath a thick white shroud, leaving families to endure an agonizing wait, suspended between a sliver of hope and the dread of what the spring thaw might reveal. As April turned to May, the weather finally began to shift. The harsh winter sun gained strength, and the snowpack that covered Kolatsyakhl and the surrounding forest began to melt, slowly surrendering the secrets it had guarded for months. The search teams refocused their efforts on a ravine located about 75 meters from the cedar tree where Doroshenko and Krivonischenko were found. It was a natural depression in the landscape, a place where the snow would have accumulated to its greatest depth. A local Mansi hunter, following a hunch, noticed a small cluster of cut fir boughs peeking through the melting snow, a clear sign of human activity that had been invisible just weeks before. This was the clue they had been waiting for. With renewed urgency, the search party began to dig. The work was difficult as the snow was wet, heavy, and still several meters deep. As they cleared away the layers of ice and snow, they uncovered what appeared to be a makeshift shelter, a crude snow den dug into the side of the ravine. The floor of the den was carefully lined with the cut fir branches and pieces of discarded clothing, a clear indication that the last 4 hikers had managed to create a temporary refuge from the brutal elements. It was a testament to their resilience and their will to survive, a final organized effort to fight off the freezing cold in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. But the discovery of the den was not a sign of survival. It was the prelude to the most horrifying discovery of the entire investigation. On May 4th, buried under 15 feet of snow within the den, the searchers found them. The bodies of the final 4 hikers were clustered together, their discovery marking the end of the long search. However, the condition in which they were found would shatter any remaining theories of a simple hiking accident. The truth revealed by the spring thaw was far darker and more violent than anyone could have imagined, plunging the entire incident into a new realm of high strangeness and inexplicable, brutal violence that defied all rational explanation. The discovery of the snow den offered a powerful, albeit tragic, narrative of the final hours of the last 4 hikers. It was clear that after the initial flight from the tent and the failed attempt to start a sustainable fire under the cedar tree, the group had split. While Dyatlov, Kolmogorova and Slobodin made their desperate attempt to return to the tent, the other four sought deeper shelter. They had found the ravine and, using their remaining strength, had dug a den into the deep snowbank. This act alone demonstrated remarkable fortitude and a clear-headed understanding of survival techniques. They knew that a snow cave could offer vital protection from the wind and maintain a temperature just below freezing, far more survivable than the -30 degrees Celsius of the open air. The interior of the den painted a poignant picture of their final organized efforts. The floor was carefully layered with branches and spare clothing, an attempt to create a barrier against the frozen ground and conserve precious body heat. This construction was not the work of people in a state of mindless panic. It was a rational and calculated act of survival. It suggested that this group, led perhaps by the older and more experienced Semyon Zolotaryov, had rallied and were working together to endure the night, likely waiting for the storm to pass so they could assess their situation in the daylight. They had created a fragile sanctuary in the heart of the storm, a last bastion against the encroaching cold. The location of the den, just a short distance from the cedar tree, suggests a timeline of events. It is likely that the four hikers remained with Doroshenko and Krivonischenko until they perished, perhaps even taking some of their clothing to aid their own survival before seeking better shelter. This grim but practical act speaks to the brutal realities of their situation. They were in a desperate fight for their lives, and every decision was geared towards that single goal. They had managed to survive for several hours longer than their companions, a testament to their resourcefulness and the relative protection afforded by their makeshift shelter. They had not given up. They were fighters to the very end. However, the relative peace and order of the snow den stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the condition of the bodies found within it. This was not a place where four people had simply succumbed to the cold. The den, which should have been their salvation, had instead become their tomb. Something terrible had happened to them in or near this final refuge. The discovery of their bodies and the catastrophic injuries they had sustained would prove to be the most baffling and disturbing aspect of the entire Dyatlov Pass incident, raising questions that point away from natural causes and towards a force of terrifying and unnatural violence. As the bodies of the final four hikers were recovered from the ravine and examined by medical investigators, a chilling new dimension was added to the mystery. Unlike the first five victims, whose deaths were attributed to hypothermia, these four had suffered massive and brutal internal injuries. The nature of these wounds was honestly just shocking. Lyudmila Dubinina had multiple broken ribs, a crushing injury to her chest that was symmetrical, as if she had been squeezed in a powerful vice. Semyon Zolotaryov had a similar, though even more extensive, set of fractured ribs on his right side. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had sustained a severe and complex fracture to his skull. Only Alexander Kolovatov was found without such traumatic injuries, having died of hypothermia. The coroner, Dr. Boris Vozrojdeny, was stunned by the extent of the damage. In his official report, he stated that the force required to cause such injuries would be equivalent to the impact of a high-speed car crash or the direct shock wave from an explosion. He was adamant that no human being could have inflicted this level of damage, as the blows were just too powerful and there were no corresponding signs of a struggle or soft tissue damage. The injuries were almost entirely internal. For example, Dubinina's and Zolotaryov's ribs were shattered, yet their skin was largely unbroken, with no external bruising or contusions to match the severity of the trauma beneath. This lack of external trauma is honestly one of the most perplexing details of the entire case. How could their bodies be so catastrophically crushed from within without any outward sign of a blow or impact? Dr. Vozrojdeny noted that the injuries resembled those seen in victims subjected to a high-pressure differential, like an explosion's blast wave. This finding has fueled decades of speculation about secret weapons testing or some other anomalous event that could produce such a specific and unusual pattern of trauma. The injuries were just not consistent with a fall, an animal attack, or a human assault, leaving investigators with a profound and disturbing puzzle. The official conclusion for the deaths of Dubinina, Zolotaryov and Thibaut Brignol was death by an unknown compelling force. This vague and unsettling terminology really reflects the utter bewilderment of the investigators. They had the bodies, they had the evidence of the trauma, but they had no conceivable explanation for how it could have happened. The discovery of these violent, inexplicable injuries transformed the case from a tragic hiking accident into a deep and sinister mystery. It was clear that the hikers had not just frozen to death, they had encountered something on that mountain, powerful enough to crush them from the inside out. A force that left no tracks and no witnesses, only riddles. Among the horrific injuries discovered on the bodies from the ravine, the condition of Lyudmila Dubinina was by far the most disturbing and has become one of the most infamous details of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Beyond her massively crushed chest, the medical examination revealed something even more bizarre and unsettling. Her tongue, hyoid bone, and parts of her lips and facial tissue were missing. The removal was clean, almost surgical, and there were no clear signs of how it could have occurred. This gruesome mutilation has been the subject of endless, often macabre, speculation, adding a layer of almost supernatural horror to the already terrifying events of that night. The official explanation put forward by investigators at the time was that these soft tissues had decomposed naturally due to the body's partial submersion in the running water at the bottom of the ravine. They argued that scavengers, such as small rodents or microorganisms present in the stream, could have been responsible for consuming the exposed tissue of her open mouth. This explanation attempts to ground the bizarre finding in the realm of natural processes. However, many independent researchers have questioned this conclusion, finding it wholly unsatisfying. They point out that scavenger activity would likely have left more ragged wounds and that other soft tissues, like her eyeballs, were still intact. The missing tongue has fueled some of the most outlandish theories about the incident. Some have suggested it was a ritualistic act performed by an unknown assailant, perhaps as a warning or a punishment for speaking about something they should not have. This line of thought often connects to theories of a military cover-up, suggesting the hikers witnessed a secret test and were silenced in the most brutal way imaginable. Others have drifted into the realm of the paranormal, speculating about an encounter with a predatory cryptid or an extraterrestrial being. While these theories lack evidence, they thrive on the sheer strangeness of the mutilation, which seems to defy any simple, rational explanation. Ultimately, the mystery of Lyudmila's missing tongue remains one of the most haunting and unresolved aspects of the case. Was it the work of tiny scavengers in a mountain stream, a mundane but grim detail in a tragic accident? Or was it a clue to something far more sinister, a deliberate act of violence that points to a human or non-human perpetrator? The ambiguity of the evidence allows for both possibilities to coexist, leaving the truth shrouded in uncertainty. This single, grotesque detail ensures that the story of Lyudmila Dubinina is not just one of a tragic death, but of a chilling enigma that continues to disturb and fascinate all who study the case. The gruesome discoveries in the ravine did not end with Lyudmila Dubinina's injuries. The medical examination reports noted another profoundly disturbing detail concerning two of the victims. Both Semyon Zolotaryov and, according to some unofficial accounts, Lyudmila Dubinina were found with their eyeballs missing. This detail, much like the missing tongue, adds a layer of visceral horror to the incident and has been a focal point for many of the more sensational theories. The idea of the victims being found without eyes evokes primal fears and creates a deeply unsettling image of their final state, suggesting a level of violence that goes beyond a simple accident or natural event. Similar to the explanation for the missing tongue, the official and most logical explanation attributes the missing eyes to natural causes. The bodies lay in a stream at the bottom of the ravine for nearly 3 months before they were discovered. The constant flow of water and the activity of putrefactive bacteria and small aquatic scavengers could easily account for the decomposition and loss of soft tissues like the eyes. The sockets are natural cavities, and the eyes themselves are gelatinous and decay rapidly, making them among the first features to be lost to the elements and post-mortem predation. For investigators seeking a rational cause, this explanation is both plausible and sufficient. However, for many researchers and enthusiasts of the mystery, this natural explanation feels too neat, too convenient to explain away such a specific and horrifying detail. They argue that if scavenging were the cause, one would expect to see more widespread damage to other soft facial tissues on all the bodies found in the ravine. The focused nature of the damage, specifically the eyes and tongue, has led many to believe it was a targeted and deliberate act. This has opened the door to theories involving unknown animals with specific feeding habits, or more sinisterly, a human perpetrator who performed the mutilations for reasons that remain terrifyingly obscure. The missing eyes, therefore, exist in the same ambiguous space as the missing tongue. They are a detail that can be interpreted in two vastly different ways. On one hand, they can be seen as a grim but understandable consequence of 3 months of decomposition in a wet, wild environment. On the other hand, they can be viewed as a key piece of evidence pointing towards an unnatural and malevolent force. This duality is central to the enduring power of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. The facts are just strange enough to discredit simple explanations, but just plausible enough to make supernatural ones seem like a leap too far, leaving the truth forever dangling just out of reach. As investigators examined the bodies recovered from the ravine, they noticed another strange and puzzling detail. Some of the hikers were wearing items of clothing that belonged to their companions. This swapped clothing added another layer of complexity to the already convoluted series of events. For instance, Lyudmila Dubinina was found with her foot wrapped in a piece of Yuri Krivonishenko's woolen trousers, and Semyon Zolotaryov was discovered wearing Dubinina's hat and coat. This sharing of garments was not random. It seemed to be a desperate and logical attempt to stave off the deadly cold after some members of the group had already perished. The most probable explanation for this strange discovery is a grim but rational one. It's likely that as the first members of the group succumbed to hypothermia, the survivors, in a desperate bid to stay alive, took clothing from their fallen friends. This is a common, if harrowing, practice in extreme survival situations. The hikers in the ravine, having built their den, would have needed every possible layer of insulation to fight the cold. Taking a coat or a hat from a companion who no longer needed it would have been a logical, albeit emotionally devastating, act of self-preservation. This suggests they were still thinking rationally and fighting for their lives until the very end. This theory is further supported by the state of the bodies found under the cedar tree. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found nearly naked, but it's highly probable that they were not in that state when they died. The survivors, likely the 4 who later retreated to the ravine, almost certainly cut the clothes from their deceased friends to use for themselves. This would explain why Krivonishenko's trousers were found on Dubinina's foot, and why the others in the ravine were better clothed than those found on the slope. It paints a bleak picture of their final hours, a small, dwindling group trying to salvage what they could from a catastrophic situation. While this practical explanation is the most widely accepted, the image of the hikers stripping their dead friends has added to the overall ghastliness of the incident. It underscores the sheer desperation of their plight. They were not just victims of a mysterious event. They were also active participants in a brutal fight for survival. The puzzle of the swapped clothes, while likely solved by simple logic, serves as a poignant reminder of their final, frantic moments. It is a testament to their will to live, even in the face of unimaginable horror and loss, and it highlights the tragic, step-by-step breakdown of their group as they fell one by one to the mountain. In the midst of the already bizarre collection of evidence, investigators uncovered a clue that propelled the Dyatlov Pass incident into the realm of Cold War conspiracy theories. When the clothing of the hikers was examined in a laboratory, several items showed traces of low-level radioactive contamination. Specifically, the sweater worn by Yuri Krivonishenko and the trousers worn by Alexander Kolovatov exhibited levels of beta radiation that were significantly higher than the normal background levels. This discovery was explosive, immediately raising questions about secret military activity, nuclear accidents, and government cover-ups. The presence of radiation seemed to be a smoking gun, pointing towards a man-made technological cause for the tragedy. The source of this radiation has been fiercely debated for decades. One popular theory posits that the hikers unknowingly wandered into a secret military testing ground. The orbs of light some claim to have seen in the sky could have been flares or the exhaust from a missile test. The hikers may have been exposed to radioactive fallout from a clandestine weapon, and the military, realizing their presence, moved in to clean up the site and silence any witnesses, which could explain the brutal injuries and the subsequent cover-up. This narrative fits neatly with the paranoia of the Cold War era and provides a single comprehensive explanation for many of the strange clues. However, more mundane explanations for the radiation also exist and are considered more plausible by many investigators. Both Krivonishenko and Kolovatov had worked in facilities related to the nuclear industry. Krivonishenko worked at the Mayak plant, a notorious nuclear complex that had been the site of a major disaster in 1957. It is entirely possible that their work clothes had been contaminated with trace amounts of radioactive material long before the expedition, and they simply brought that contamination with them. The levels detected were relatively low and not nearly high enough to have caused radiation sickness or death, making it a potential red herring rather than a central clue. Ultimately, the radioactive clothing remains another deeply ambiguous piece of the puzzle. It can be interpreted as evidence of a vast military conspiracy or as a simple coincidental detail related to the hikers' occupations. There is no definitive proof to support either conclusion. The Soviet authorities never acknowledged any military activity in the area at that time, and the levels of contamination were not lethal. Like so many other aspects of the case, the hint of radioactivity serves to deepen the mystery rather than solve it, allowing for a wide spectrum of theories, ranging from the plausible to the conspiratorial, ensuring the debate over what truly happened continues to this day. After 3 months of investigation filled with baffling discoveries and a distinct lack of concrete answers, the official criminal case was formally closed at the end of May 1959. The lead prosecutor, Lev Ivanov, concluded the investigation with a statement that has become almost as famous as the incident itself. He wrote that the hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. This conclusion is remarkably vague and deeply unsatisfying, a bureaucratic shrug in the face of overwhelming strangeness. It effectively closed the book on the case without providing any real explanation for the hikers' bizarre behavior, their catastrophic injuries, or the other strange clues found at the scene. The official verdict failed to address the most pressing questions. What was this compelling natural force? If it was an avalanche, as was later suggested, why was the tent not crushed? And why were the injuries inconsistent with typical avalanche trauma? If it was a weather event, like a tornado or infrasound, why is there so little evidence for such phenomena? The verdict neatly sidestepped the issues of the internal injuries, the missing tongue, and the radiation, lumping everything under a mysterious, undefined force of nature. This ambiguity has led many to believe that the conclusion was a deliberate cover-up, designed to hide a truth that was too secret or too terrifying for the public to know. Lev Ivanov himself would later add fuel to these conspiracy theories. In an interview years later, long after the fall of the Soviet Union, he admitted that he had been ordered by high-ranking regional officials to close the case and classify the findings. He also spoke of his own personal belief that the orbs of light reported by other witnesses in the area around the same time were connected to the incident. He hinted that he knew more than he was allowed to say, suggesting a military or UFO-related event that the state was determined to conceal. His later statements have cast a long shadow of doubt over the integrity of the original investigation. As a result, the official conclusion has done little to quell the speculation. In fact, its very vagueness has had the opposite effect, creating a vacuum that has been filled by countless theories over the past 60 years. The case files were classified and sent to a secret archive, effectively sealing them from public scrutiny for decades. The story of the 9 hikers who died on Dead Mountain was officially over, but the mystery was just beginning. The unsatisfying verdict ensured that the Dyatlov Pass incident would not be forgotten, but would instead grow into a legendary enigma, a chilling testament to the unknown that continues to captivate and haunt us. Among the myriad explanations for the Dyatlov Pass incident, the avalanche theory has long been considered the most rational and scientifically plausible. Proponents of this theory suggest that a slab avalanche, a specific type of snowslide where a cohesive block of snow breaks free, occurred on the slope above the hiker's tent. The sound of the snowpack cracking or the immense pressure of the snow piling up against the side of the tent could have been the trigger for the initial panic. Believing they were about to be buried alive, the hikers would have had only seconds to react, which would explain why they frantically cut their way out of the tent rather than fumbling with the entrance. The theory posits that the initial slide was not massive enough to completely bury or crush the tent, but it was significant enough to cause damage and instill a deep fear of a second, much larger avalanche. The weight of the snow could have pinned some of the hikers or blocked their exit, forcing them to use knives to escape. Once outside, their immediate priority would have been to move to a safer location away from the perceived avalanche path. This would explain their retreat down the slope towards the forest, a logical move to escape the immediate danger zone. The darkness and the blizzard would have made it impossible to return for their gear, forcing them to face the elements unprepared. In this scenario, some of the hikers could have sustained injuries during the initial snowslide. The heavy, compacted snow could have easily caused the skull fracture on Slobodin, or the severe chest trauma seen on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. As the group fled, these injured members would have slowed the others down, eventually succumbing to their wounds and the extreme cold. The rest of the group, scattered and disoriented, would have then slowly frozen to death while trying to build a fire or make their way back to the tent. The avalanche theory provides a single, naturalistic explanation that attempts to account for the initial panic, the flight from the tent, and the subsequent deaths from hypothermia and trauma. In 2021, a study by Swiss researchers using advanced computer modeling and data from General Motors car crash simulations lent new credence to this hypothesis. They argued that a specific combination of factors, the angle of the slope, the presence of a weak layer in the snowpack, and undercutting from the hikers digging out a platform for their tent, could have created the conditions for a delayed slab avalanche. This scientific backing has made the avalanche theory the leading official explanation in recent years, a seemingly logical solution to a puzzle that has long been dominated by more sensational and speculative ideas. It offers a narrative grounded in the known dangers of mountaineering. Despite its scientific backing and apparent logic, the avalanche theory is riddled with significant inconsistencies that have led many investigators and researchers to question its validity. One of the most glaring issues is the condition and location of the tent itself. Searchers who found the tent noted that it was not buried or crushed, but rather collapsed under the weight of later snowfall. The ski poles used to pitch the tent were still standing, which seems highly unlikely if a powerful slab of snow had slid into it. Furthermore, the tracks leading away from the tent were orderly at first, suggesting a calm walk rather than a frantic scramble away from an imminent, life-threatening snowslide, which is inconsistent with the panic an avalanche would induce. The nature of the injuries also presents a major challenge to this theory. While an avalanche can certainly cause blunt force trauma, the injuries sustained by Dubinina and Zolotaryov were highly specific and symmetrical, more akin to a crushing force than the chaotic tumbling of a snowslide. Dr. Vozrojdeny, the original medical examiner, was adamant that the force was comparable to a car crash and, crucially, that there was no corresponding external soft tissue damage. This is highly atypical for avalanche victims who usually exhibit extensive external bruising, abrasions and fractures. The severe skull fracture of Thibaut Brignol, without significant external signs, is also hard to reconcile with being hit by a mass of snow and ice. Another significant point of contention is the behavior of the hikers after fleeing the tent. If they were escaping a known avalanche zone, their primary goal should have been to get to safety, and then, once the danger passed, to retrieve their life-saving equipment. An experienced leader like Igor Dyatlov would have known that their chances of survival without their gear were virtually zero, yet there is no evidence that they made a concerted effort to circle back to the tent once they reached the relative safety of the tree line. Instead, some attempted a direct, exhausting climb back up the slope, while others built a den, suggesting they were dealing with a persistent threat, not a past event. Finally, the very premise of an avalanche on that particular slope has been questioned by experienced mountaineers and the original investigators. The slope's angle, at less than 30 degrees, is generally not considered steep enough to pose a significant avalanche risk. There were also no classic signs of a recent avalanche reported by the initial search teams, who were themselves experienced in mountain environments. The lack of debris, a clear slide path, or a fracture line at the time of discovery makes the avalanche scenario difficult to prove. These cracks in the theory leave the door wide open for other explanations, suggesting that the compelling natural force might have been something else entirely. Stepping away from the physical impact of an avalanche, another scientific theory suggests the hikers were victims of a much more insidious and invisible force infrasound. This hypothesis proposes that a rare and powerful weather phenomenon, such as a Kármán vortex street, could have been generated as wind moved over the specific topography of Kholat Syakhl. This could create intense, low-frequency sound waves below the range of normal human hearing, but capable of having profound physiological and psychological effects. The theory suggests that these sound waves, resonating with the body's own frequencies, could induce feelings of intense, irrational panic, nausea, and dread. According to this explanation, the hikers safely inside their tent would have been suddenly overcome by an overwhelming and inexplicable sense of terror. This primal fear, with no apparent source, would have been utterly disorienting, causing them to believe they were in grave danger from an unseen threat. This could explain their bizarre and illogical decision to cut their way out of the tent and flee into the deadly cold. The infrasound would have effectively driven them mad, overriding their training, their logic, and their most basic survival instincts. They were not running from something they saw, they were running from a feeling, an unbearable sensation of horror generated within their own bodies. The infrasound hypothesis could also potentially account for the internal injuries. If the sound waves were powerful enough, they could have caused violent, resonant vibrations within the body's cavities, leading to organ damage and internal hemorrhaging without any external signs of impact. This would align with the coroner's report of severe internal trauma with no corresponding soft tissue damage. In this scenario, the hikers were not attacked or crushed by an external object, but rather torn apart from the inside by the relentless, silent assault of low-frequency sound. The theory presents a chilling vision of nature's power to kill in ways that are both invisible and terrifying. This explanation provides a neat, if unsettling, framework for many of the puzzling aspects of the case. It accounts for the sudden, irrational panic, the flight from the tent, and even the bizarrely specific internal injuries. It paints a picture of the hikers as victims of a freak natural event, a perfect storm of wind, terrain, and physics that turned the mountain itself into a weapon. The idea that a simple gust of wind could be twisted into a force capable of inducing madness and death is a compelling and horrifying one, offering a potential solution that is both natural and profoundly strange, fitting the bizarre nature of the evidence left behind. While the infrasound hypothesis offers an elegant and honestly pretty chilling explanation for the hikers' strange behavior, it suffers from one major, insurmountable flaw: a complete and total lack of direct evidence. The theory is, well, almost entirely speculative, based on a series of assumptions about what could have happened rather than on any concrete data collected from the site. There is simply no way to prove that a Kármán vortex street or any other infrasound-generating phenomenon actually occurred on Kholat Syakhl on that fateful night in 1959. The weather conditions, while harsh, were not documented with the kind of detail needed to confirm the presence of such a rare and specific meteorological event. Furthermore, the science behind the physiological effects of infrasound is itself a subject of debate. While low-frequency sound can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, and disorientation, the idea that it could induce a level of panic sufficient to make 9 experienced hikers flee to their certain deaths is a significant leap. Even more speculative is the notion that sound waves could generate the kind of massive car crash-level internal injuries found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol. There is currently no scientific consensus or experimental evidence to support the claim that infrasound can cause such catastrophic physical trauma to the human body. The experience of the hikers themselves also cast doubt on this theory. These were not novices. They were seasoned mountaineers who had spent countless nights in the wilderness. They were familiar with the strange sounds of the wind in the mountains, the groaning of ice, and the unsettling silence of the wild. It just seems unlikely that a group with their collective experience would be so completely overwhelmed by an auditory phenomenon, even a powerful one. One would expect at least one member of the group to maintain enough composure to question the source of the panic, rather than the entire group succumbing to a simultaneous, unthinking flight. Ultimately, the infrasound hypothesis, while intellectually intriguing, remains firmly in the realm of conjecture. It is a ghost theory. It cannot be proven, but it also cannot be definitively disproven, leaving it to linger as a tantalizing but unsupported possibility. It requires a perfect alignment of rare weather phenomena and extreme physiological reactions that have little precedent. Without any physical evidence or strong scientific backing for its more extreme claims, the theory serves more as a fascinating thought experiment than a credible solution to the Dyatlov Pass mystery. It is a compelling story, but one that is built on silence and speculation. Given the time and place, the height of the Cold War in the secretive Soviet Union, it is really no surprise that theories involving military activity are among the most popular and persistent. This school of thought suggests that the hikers were accidental witnesses to, or victims of, a clandestine weapons test. The northern Urals were a remote and sparsely populated region, making them an ideal location for the military to conduct secret operations far from prying eyes. The theory posits that the hikers tragically stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time, seeing something they were never meant to see, such as a missile test, a new type of aircraft, or even a radiological weapon. The orbs of light reported by other witnesses in the region around the same time are often cited as key evidence for this theory. These lights could have been flares used to illuminate a target area, the glowing exhaust of a rocket engine, or the parachute flares of a descending test device. The sudden appearance of such a phenomenon could have been the trigger for the hikers' panic. The subsequent internal injuries could be explained by the concussive blast wave from a nearby explosion. This would align with the coroner's assessment that the force was similar to an explosion and would explain the lack of external soft tissue damage. This theory also provides a motive for the alleged cover-up by the authorities. If the hikers were killed as a result of a secret military operation, the state would have had every reason to conceal the truth. This would explain the vague official verdict of a compelling natural force, the classification of the case files, and the pressure on investigator Lev Ivanov to close the case quickly and quietly. The missing tongue and eyes could be interpreted as acts of deliberate mutilation by a military cleanup crew to silence the victims or to create a terrifying deterrent for anyone else who might wander into the restricted zone. The traces of radiation found on some of the hikers' clothing further bolster the military conspiracy narrative. While the levels were low, their very presence seems to point towards a nuclear or radiological component to the event. In this version of the story, the hikers are not just tragic victims of an accident, but casualties of the Cold War. Their deaths, a small, inconvenient piece of collateral damage in the grand, dangerous game being played by superpowers. This theory weaves together many of the disparate, bizarre clues into a single, cohesive and sinister narrative of state-sponsored secrecy and violence. For all its narrative appeal, the military involvement theory suffers from a critical weakness. the complete absence of any verifiable concrete evidence. While the idea of a secret weapons test is plausible for the era, no declassified Soviet records or credible whistleblowers have ever emerged to confirm any such activity in the Dyatlov Pass area on that specific night. The entire theory is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, assumptions, and the interpretation of ambiguous clues. There is no smoking gun, no piece of shrapnel, no unusual crater, and no definitive proof of a military presence at the scene. The orbs of light, often cited as proof, are themselves unreliable evidence. These sightings were reported over a wide area and on different dates, making it difficult to directly link them to the specific time and location of the incident. Furthermore, such lights could have been caused by a number of mundane phenomena, including meteorological events or the launch of regular R-7 Semyorka rockets from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, hundreds of miles away, which were known to create spectacular visual displays in the upper atmosphere that could be seen over vast distances. Without a direct confirmed sighting at the tent site, the orbs remain a tantalizing but unproven connection. The physical evidence found on the hikers also presents problems for the military theory. If there had been an explosion powerful enough to cause the observed internal injuries, one would expect to find other signs of a blast, such as burned or scorched materials, shrapnel wounds, or a blast crater. None of this was reported by investigators. Similarly, if a military cleanup crew had been dispatched to silence the witnesses, it seems unlikely they would have left behind such a bizarre and confusing trail of evidence. A professional cleanup operation would likely have been far more thorough, either removing the bodies entirely or staging a much more convincing-looking accident. Finally, the low levels of radiation detected on the clothing are not conclusive. As previously noted, the contamination can be plausibly explained by the hikers' prior employment in the nuclear industry. The levels were not high enough to be lethal or even to cause sickness, which makes them weak evidence for a radiological weapon. While the idea of a Cold War conspiracy is compelling and seems to explain the official secrecy, it ultimately remains a theory built on speculation. Without a confession, a declassified document, or a piece of physical evidence from the site, the military hypothesis is destined to remain a shadowy and unproven narrative. A more primal and straightforward theory suggests that the hikers were attacked by a large aggressive animal. The Ural Mountains are home to predators such as bears and wolverines, and an unexpected encounter with a large territorial animal in the dark could certainly induce the kind of panic that would cause the group to flee their tent. The sound of a large predator sniffing or clawing at the canvas could have been the trigger for them to cut their way out and run for their lives. This explanation has the benefit of simplicity, relying on a known danger of the wilderness rather than a rare meteorological event or a secret conspiracy. In this scenario, the group fled the tent to escape the immediate threat. Their initial destination would have been the forest, where climbing a tree would offer protection from a ground-based predator. This could explain the broken branches high up on the cedar tree, suggesting a desperate attempt to get out of reach of an attacker. The scattered state of the bodies could be the result of the group splitting up in the chaos of the attack, with the animal pursuing some while others succumbed to the elements. The theory offers a direct and easily understandable cause for the initial flight and the ensuing chaos. However, this theory quickly falls apart under scrutiny. The most significant piece of evidence against it is the complete lack of any animal tracks found at the scene. Investigators meticulously examined the area around the tent and reported only the hikers' own footprints. A large animal like a bear or a wolverine would have left distinct and obvious tracks in the snow. Furthermore, the nature of the injuries is inconsistent with an animal attack. The massive internal trauma with no external wounds does not match the bite marks and claw slashes that would be the hallmark of a predatory assault. The tent was also cut from the inside, not ripped from the outside, as one would expect. Even the more gruesome details do not align with an animal attack. While an animal scavenger could explain the missing tongue and eyes of the victims in the ravine, it would not have caused the initial panic miles away at the tent. It also fails to account for the catastrophic chest and skull injuries, which were far too powerful and precise to have been inflicted by the claws or jaws of any known local predator. Ultimately, the animal attack theory, while simple on the surface, is contradicted by nearly every major piece of physical evidence, from the lack of tracks to the specific nature of the trauma, making it one of the least likely explanations for the tragedy. When rational explanations fail to satisfy, human nature often turns to the supernatural, and the Dyatlov Pass incident is a prime candidate for such speculation. These theories abandon the constraints of conventional science and enter the realm of folklore, cryptozoology and ufology. One of the most enduring supernatural theories involves an encounter with a menk, the Siberian equivalent of the Yeti or Bigfoot. Proponents of this theory point to a blurry photograph from the hiker's camera that appears to show a large, dark humanoid figure standing among the trees, suggesting they were being stalked by a mysterious creature. An attack by such a powerful and unknown beast could explain the immense fear and the crushing injuries. Another branch of supernatural theory focuses on the orbs of light and suggests an extraterrestrial encounter. In this narrative, the lights in the sky were UFOs, and the hikers were either directly attacked by alien beings or were collateral damage in some form of otherworldly activity. This could account for the inexplicable technology needed to produce the internal injuries, the radiation, and the bizarre mutilations. The government cover-up in this version was not to hide a weapons test, but to conceal the terrifying truth of alien visitation from the public, a secret deemed too destabilizing to reveal. The ancient folklore of the local Mansi people also provides a supernatural framework. As the name Dead Mountain suggests, the area was considered cursed or haunted long before the 1959 incident. According to Mansi legends, the mountain was home to powerful and malevolent spirits who would punish any mortals who dared to trespass on their sacred ground. In this interpretation, the hikers were not victims of an avalanche or a military test, but of an ancient, vengeful spirit. This explanation aligns with the profound sense of inexplicable terror and the unnatural character of the deaths, attributing them to a force beyond human comprehension. While these supernatural theories are compelling and capture the imagination, they suffer from a complete lack of empirical evidence. The Yeti photograph is highly ambiguous and likely a case of pareidolia, seeing a pattern where none exists. The UFO theory relies on anecdotal sightings and speculation with no physical proof of an alien presence. The Mansi legends, while culturally significant, are articles of faith, not forensic evidence. These theories thrive in the absence of a satisfactory, rational explanation, offering mythic answers to a mystery that seems to defy logic. They are powerful stories, but they remain just that, stories. Perhaps the greatest inconsistency of all is the attempt to find a single theory that explains everything. It is entirely possible that the Dyatlov Pass incident was not the result of one single event, but a cascade of multiple, interlocking misfortunes. This perfect storm scenario suggests that a combination of factors, each one unlikely on its own, occurred in a tragic sequence. For example, the initial panic might have been caused by a natural event, like a small avalanche or a terrifying weather phenomenon, forcing the group to flee the tent. This initial event would explain their flight, but not necessarily the most severe injuries. Once outside and exposed to the elements, a second event could have occurred. Perhaps in the disorienting darkness and blizzard, some of the group fell into the ravine, sustaining their crushing injuries on the rocks below. This could explain the specific trauma found on the 4 hikers in the den. This fall, combined with the extreme cold, would have been fatal. Meanwhile, the other members of the group, scattered on the slope and by the cedar tree, would have succumbed to hypothermia while trying to fight their way back to safety. This combination of an avalanche and a fall provides a more nuanced, if complex, naturalistic explanation. This cascade theory can also incorporate other elements. The orbs of light could have been an entirely separate event, a coincidental missile launch that the terrified and disoriented hikers saw, adding to their confusion and fear but not directly causing their deaths. The radiation could be a simple coincidence from their previous occupations. In this view, there is no single key to the mystery. Instead, it is a tragic puzzle where several different pieces, some natural, some man-made, and some pure coincidence, came together in the worst possible way on that specific night, creating a uniquely baffling and horrific outcome. However, even this composite approach leaves many questions unanswered. It still struggles to explain the initial orderly retreat from the tent, the lack of external wounds on the most severely injured victims, and the bizarre mutilations. The cascade theory feels more plausible than any single explanation, yet it still feels incomplete. It highlights the central problem of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Every logical path seems to lead to a dead end, blocked by a contradictory piece of evidence. The refusal of the facts to fit neatly into any one narrative, or even a combination of them, is precisely why the mystery endures. A chilling testament to the terrifying possibility that sometimes there is no single, simple truth to be found. More than 6 decades have passed since the 9 hikers of the Dyatlov expedition met their enigmatic end on the slopes of Kolatsiakl. Yet the story continues to resonate with a chilling and profound power. The incident endures not simply because it is an unsolved case, but because it represents a perfect and terrifying confluence of the known and the unknown. We have so much information: the hikers' own diaries and photographs, the detailed investigative reports, the autopsy findings, and the physical evidence left at the scene. We can trace their steps, feel their optimism, and map their final, desperate movements. Yet for all this data, the central question, the why, remains stubbornly, maddeningly out of reach, locked away in the frozen silence of that February night. The persistence of the mystery lies in its inherent contradictions. Every piece of evidence that seems to point towards a solution is immediately undermined by another that points in the opposite direction. An avalanche theory is contradicted by the undisturbed tent and the orderly footprints. A military theory is weakened by the lack of any physical proof of a weapon or explosion. Natural phenomena like infrasound remain purely speculative, while supernatural explanations require a leap of faith that science cannot make. The case is a fortress of ambiguity, its walls built from facts that refuse to align into a single coherent narrative. It is this resistance to a simple explanation that fuels our collective fascination and keeps us coming back to the story, searching for a key that may not exist. The emotional core of the tragedy is the profound loss of life, the extinguishing of 9 young, vibrant souls who were poised on the threshold of their futures. Igor, Zina, Lyudmila, and their companions were not just statistics in an unsolved case. They were bright, capable, and courageous individuals filled with dreams and ambitions. They were friends, sons, and daughters. Their final documented days show them full of life and camaraderie, making their violent and inexplicable end all the more heartbreaking. The mystery captivates us, but it is the human element, the empathy we feel for the victims and their terrifying final hours, that gives the story its lasting emotional weight and transforms it from a mere puzzle into a poignant and enduring tragedy. Ultimately, the Dyatlov Pass incident serves as a stark and humbling reminder of the limits of human understanding. It confronts us with the unsettling possibility that there are forces in this world, whether natural or otherwise, that defy our attempts to categorize and explain them. The case is a challenge to our desire for order and reason, a narrative that collapses every time we try to impose a definitive structure upon it. It is a story carved in ice and mystery, a permanent monument to the questions we cannot answer. The hikers went seeking adventure in the untamed wilderness, and in their final moments they found a mystery far deeper and darker than any mountain they ever intended to climb. The legacy of the Dyatlov Pass incident extends far beyond the confines of a simple cold case file. It has become a modern myth, a piece of global folklore for the 21st century, passed down through documentaries, books, podcasts, and late-night internet forums. The story's details are so uniquely strange, so perfectly balanced between the plausible and the fantastic, that they invite endless speculation. It has become a canvas onto which we project our deepest fears, Fear of the unknown, fear of the unforgiving power of nature, fear of secret government conspiracies, and fear of forces that lie beyond our comprehension. The tale's ability to accommodate so many different theories is precisely what makes it so timeless and perpetually engaging for new generations of investigators. This enduring echo is also a testament to the unresolved grief and the quest for justice that has surrounded the case for decades. For the families of the victims, and for those who have dedicated their lives to studying the incident, the vague official conclusion of a compelling natural force has never been enough. The reopening of the case by Russian authorities in 2019, which once again concluded with the avalanche theory, did little to quell the doubts. This persistent push for answers reflects a deep-seated human need for closure and truth. The feeling that the full story has not been told, that something is being concealed or has been overlooked, keeps the flame of inquiry burning brightly. The incident forces us to contemplate the fragility of our own well-ordered world. The Dyatlov group was prepared, experienced, and equipped. They followed the rules of survival, yet they were confronted by something that rendered all their knowledge and preparation useless. This aspect of the story is deeply unsettling, as it suggests that no amount of expertise can protect us from the truly unexpected. It is a chilling reminder that the line between safety and catastrophe can be crossed in an instant, and that the wilderness, both literal and metaphorical, holds dangers that we may never be able to anticipate or overcome, pushing us to the edge of our own understanding. As we look back on the fate of the 9 hikers, we are left with a profound sense of awe and unease. The slopes of Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, continue to hold their secrets, echoing with the unanswered questions of that night. The story of the Dyatlov Pass incident is not just a mystery to be solved, it is a cautionary tale, a ghost story, and a human tragedy all rolled into one. It remains a powerful and chilling reminder that some enigmas may be destined to remain unsolved, their truths lost to the wind and the snow, forever echoing in the vast silent wilderness where they took their last